This is Land of Havilah, Isaiah 3. In this chapter, Isaiah paints a portrait of national decline because he sees it coming. There's nothing to indicate what part of his life he received this prophecy or when the decline would come. It's just that the nation is unfaithful to Yahweh, therefore they'll reap the consequences. Verse 1. For behold, the Lord Yahweh of armies takes away from Jerusalem and from Judah supply and support, the whole supply of bread and the whole supply of water, the mighty man, the man of war, the judge, the prophet, the diviner, the elder, the captain of 50, the honorable man, the counselor, the skilled craftsman, and the clever enchanter. Comment in verse 1, Isaiah says, Behold, Yahweh of armies takes away. The grammar is present tense, but it becomes clear in the rest of the chapter that this is a future event, that Yahweh will take away everything good and honorable from the land. In verses 1 to 3, Judah and Jerusalem will lose their whole supply of bread and water. There'll be no mighty man to deliver them, no men of God or men of wisdom. There'll be no skilled craftsmen left, so businesses are failing. The military's failing, the leadership is failing, and the last thing, there'll be no clever enchanter, also translated eloquent orator, which makes more sense in the context of verses 1 to 3, that Yahweh's taking away all that's good and helpful. There'll be no one who's even capable of articulating the problem or putting his finger on the problem, no eloquent orator. Now, more description of that dreadful time, verse 4. I will give boys to be their princes, and children shall rule over them. The people will be oppressed, everyone by another, and everyone by his neighbor. The child will behave himself proudly against the old man, and the wicked against the honorable. Indeed, a man shall take hold of his brother in the house of his father, saying, You have clothing, you be our ruler, and let this ruin be under your hand. In that day he'll cry out, saying, I'll not be a healer, for in my house is neither bread nor clothing. You shall not make me a ruler of the people. Comment verses 4 and 5, as a form of punishment, Yahweh will put boys and children in positions of authority. The rulers will be youthful and inexperienced. In verse 5, there'll be loss of respect. Children will disrespect old men. The wicked will disrespect the honorable. In verses 6 and 7, the land will be such that no one in his right mind wants to rule it. Brother will say to brother, You have some decent clothes. You rise up and be the ruler. Fix this country. And the brother will say, Not me. I need to look to my own needs because I do not have decent clothes or even food for myself. If I can't heal my own problems, I sure can't heal the problems of the nation. By this point of the chapter, it becomes clear that in verse 1, when Yahweh said he would take away the whole supply of bread and water, he was speaking spiritually. With no supply of bread or water in the literal sense, everyone would die in a matter of days. But obviously in verses 4 to 7 that we just read, life goes on. But the thing is, there's no spiritual sustenance from Yahweh. Yahweh has stopped feeding and watering the people in the spiritual sense. They're not hearing from God, or they wouldn't be in such a decline. Coming up, why has God distanced himself from his people? Verse 8. For Jerusalem is ruined and Judah is fallen because their tongue and their doings are against Yahweh, to provoke the eyes of his glory. The look of their faces testify against them. They parade their sin like Sodom. They don't hide it. Woe to their soul, for they've brought disaster upon themselves. Comment verse 8 makes use of the prophetic present tense again because Isaiah sees it now, therefore he expresses it in the present tense, but the manifestation of it will be in the future. It says Jerusalem is ruined and Judah is fallen, but what that means is that Jerusalem will be ruined and Judah will fall. And why? Because they sin and provoke Yahweh in verses 8 and 9. Now verse 10. Tell the righteous good, for they shall eat the fruit of their deeds. Woe to the wicked, disaster is upon them, for the deeds of his hands will be paid back to him. Comment, Isaiah says, good for the righteous, they'll be fine. The decline won't affect them as much, but woe to the wicked, they'll have disaster. Everyone's deeds will come home to roost, good or bad. Now more characteristics of that coming time, verse 12. As for my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. My people, those who lead you, cause you to err, and destroy the way of your paths. Yahweh stands up to contend and stands to judge the peoples. Comment in verse 12, children are their oppressors, which is that their leaders will be young and immature males, as was stated earlier in verse 4. And women rule over the land in verse 12, so women in leadership is another sign of decline, not that the women who step up to lead are doing anything wrong, but that Yahweh has removed mature men of stature from the land, as he said in verses 2 and 3, and there's no interest among males to lead, as in verse 7. Now more about the decline and why it's coming, verse 14. Yahweh will enter into judgment with the elders of his people and their leaders. It's you who've eaten up the vineyard. The plunder of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean that you crush my people and grind the face of the poor, says the Lord, Yahweh of armies. Comment in verses 14 and 15, the elders and leaders crush the people and grind the face of the poor. The government is oppressive. There's either forced labor or excessive taxation. Yahweh isn't pleased. Now, a 9-verse section that the women of the land are provoking Yahweh with their seduction, enticement, charm, flirting, and glamour, all of it a sign of their arrogance. Verse 16. Moreover, Yahweh said, because the daughters of Zion are arrogant and walk with outstretched necks and flirting eyes, walking to trip as they go, jiggling ornaments on their feet. Therefore the Lord brings sores on the crown of the head of the women of Zion, and Yahweh will make their scalps bald. In that day the Lord will take away the beauty of their anklets, the headbands, the crescent necklaces, the earrings, the bracelets, the veils, the headdresses, the ankle chains, the sashes, the perfume containers, the charms, the signet rings, the nose rings, the fine robes, the capes, the cloaks, the purses, the hand mirrors, the fine linen garments, the tiaras, and the shawls. It shall happen that instead of sweet spices there shall be rottenness, instead of a belt, a rope, instead of well-set hair, baldness, instead of a robe, a wearing of sackcloth, and branding instead of beauty. Comment in verses 16 to 24, the Lord will put a stop to all that flirtatious and arrogant nonsense. In verse 16, the women are walking to trip as they go, also translated, they walk with mincing steps. They walk seductively. And there are all the seductive jewelry items, clothing accessories, perfumes, mirrors, and hairdos. Yahweh's not having any of it. He'll put a stop to it. And verse 25, your men shall fall by the sword, and your mighty in the war. Her gates shall lament and mourn, and she shall be desolate and sit on the ground. Comment, the city gates were natural meeting places. There were people coming and going, hearing the news, socializing, and so forth. So when it says her gates shall lament and mourn, it means everyone in the gates will lament and mourn the condition of the country. It'll be the sad topic of discussion. It's amazing how much all this applies to modern times, that we've had immature and feckless leaders, so much disrespect everywhere, so few voices of wisdom, such focus on sexuality and allurement, economic decline, military decline, and political decline. So God deliver us from all that. Isaiah 4 is next.